отзовется нам эхо давнего парада.
V in 1967 is, in my opinion, one of the best horror films made before 1970, and has for many years now been among my absolute favorites. But as a work, it can be quite slow, at times borders on being outright propaganda for the Soviet Union, and feels like it basically lacks any semblance of a plot structure whatsoever. But all of those things kind of ultimately come back around to work in its favor, to deliver something that is kind of unlike anything else that's ever existed. This was the first horror film that was made legally in the Soviet Union, which famously was very against horror cinema in part because they recognized its ability to act as a form of social power, to, question authoritarianism. And so this alone makes V stand out substantially as a strange outlier for its time, as there were only like 10 or so films that could reasonably be described as horror movies that were made under the Soviet regime, with most of them coming out in the late 80s before their fall, where they began to lighten restrictions that were placed on artists in an attempt to calm social unrest and remain in power, which obviously was too little too late by then. V skirted these regulations by adapting the story of the same name by Russian author Nikolai Gogol, which he claimed that his story itself was based on Russian folklore. Although that claim is debatable, and the majority of what is going on here is more or less entirely a fabrication of his own imagination. But the filmmakers only barely skirted censorship, and did so through their reinforcement of Soviet ideals throughout the script, and not by really acting as a horror film for the majority of its runtime. As, even though it is not based on any particular folktale, it is very much in line with the storytelling motifs that one would associate with a fairy tale, and is all the better because of it. We start by following three boys who are dismissed from break from their university, that are each studying different aspects of faith and the nature of the human condition: a theologian, a philosopher, and a rhetorician. Three jobs that, when combined, could theoretically create the ideal form of what a leader of the faith within a community should be. And while traveling along the countryside, they find themselves in a situation that exists solely in the uncanny. An inn that is run by an old woman who is being played by a man, who claims that her house is filled with people that we never actually hear, see, or witness any substantial evidence that they actually exist. But because the inn is full, they are forced to either sleep outside or in her stable. And one of them, the philosopher, is awakened by the woman in his sleep, to discover that she's actually a witch who has cursed him to behave like a horse, that she then rides across the landscape on, eventually taking to the air and flying away. And this whole sequence really alone would be worthy enough of discussing the film, and it ends up just being the prelude to a whole ordeal. I absolutely love the weird rear projection stuff that they have going on with this flight sequence. Especially this shot when they're first taking off. It isn't realistic, it isn't even believable, but it's stylized, and has a charm of character which I think speaks for a hell of a lot more. And there's a lot of things like this going on in this film. Later at a different inn, they utilize the same techniques to simulate the off-kilter feeling of being entirely too drunk. And it is one of the best examples of that particularly awful bodily sensation that I've ever seen put to a visual form. The budget for this thing was basically non-existent. From what I can tell, this was shot for about $30,000, and what they were able to achieve with that is kind of astonishing. And they work around some of the limitations in really charming ways that aid the piece, such as this use of painted backdrops in some shots to fill out the landscape. I love stuff like this. I don't know the last film that I've seen that actually used an unconvincing painting as a background, but it's something that filmmakers should play with again as a stylistic decision, as the whole film is just gorgeous. Every single shot of this is framed in a really nice way that is complemented by its aspect ratio. I obviously think that taller and narrower ratios as far as width is concerned are just in general a more pretty way to frame a subject. I hate how the modern conversation around aspect ratio has been contorted around A24 film culture and TikTok talking points, in that if you're using a ratio that isn't standard cinema widescreen, then you're just doing it to invoke some sort of false image of artistic superiority. It's what I use basically in all of my work, and I do it because I think it looks better. I think it's a better way to present information to draw the focus of an audience, and I love to see when it's done really well, like in a film such as this. There's just a lot of shots in this, like some of the country scenery, or ones in the village like the windmill, that just wouldn't work in standard widescreen. In that way, it does lean into a heavy, kind of European feel, Like, as far as shot composition and tone, it does invoke a lot of what was going on in that realm of art cinema at the time, reminding me a lot of early Bergman and work such as that, as well as a lot of Eisenstein too, who was very obsessed with composition in every shot of his entire body of work. On that note, if you haven't seen Hour or the Wolf, you really should, not just because it's an amazing horror film that you can learn a lot from, but also just as an example of how to successfully utilize a smaller aspect ratio to build mood. And the same can very much be said as well for Ivan the Terrible Parts 1 and 2. So here's where the film gets conceptually weird in a way that I don't mind, but I also don't understand. And your mileage with this entirely is dependent on how you roll with what happens next. As the philosopher beats the old woman to death, and as she dies, she transforms into a young, beautiful woman. The philosopher is soon after then sent to a rural village to pray over the body of a noble's daughter that has suddenly passed away, only to then discover upon seeing the corpse that it is indeed the body of the old woman whom he beat to death and left out in the countryside. And we start to wonder if even this whole village is a concoction on the part of the witch, and if we have somehow entered into a place that is not real and instead made of malice and trickery. This is the section where it really seemingly falls into what feels like, from an outsider's perspective, outright government-sponsored propaganda. You know my politics, that's no secret, and I don't want to get bogged down into the micro-eccentricities of what is left and right coded within the power structure of the Soviet Union, as a lot of what they were doing was veiled in very leftist politics in a sense, in that they were focused on the collective but were still doing it through an authoritarian lens, and really it's difficult to distill exactly what their politics were in a simple abbreviated form. But I bring this up to say that I don't like when art from communist countries or organizations feel the need to inject that into a story in a way that feels inorganic and gets in the way of what the film is actually trying to accomplish. There's a lot of idealization of living off the land, like just shots of happy farmers, animals, people drinking, dancing, and singing together in the evenings. And this rural life of agricultural cultivation is what gives him the emotional strength and fortitude to do his duty to his Lord here on earth as well as in heaven, to pray over this dead girl for her salvation. And this is all intercut with a great deal of talk about the bravery of the rural Cossack people, who clearly have built a system of relying on one another. And, this all mixed with the opening production logo of two workers holding up the light of heaven together just feels like this is in the film because it has to be, rather than it actually being purposeful, if that makes sense. I think this is kind of a difficult idea to express, but I obviously feel like horror should embody leftist ideals, but that those films should be expressing those ideas from a place of passion. Like, take I Saw the TV Glow. It is clearly passionate about telling a story from the queer trans perspective, and that's what makes it great art. But it really feels like these folks were passionate about the weird folk horror stuff, and are only throwing in all the communal living material to appease the party, so that the film could even be made in the first place. You can just immediately tell the difference between something that someone actually feels strongly about and when someone is just paying lip service to someone else with power, and that is how a lot of this comes across, at least to me. And, maybe I'm wrong. It's happened plenty of times before, and this may all be entirely culturally authentic and genuine on the part of the filmmakers, but I also just kinda doubt it. This was during the era of Soviet realism within Soviet art that sought to use art as a tool to uphold the values of the Stalinistic party. And even though he was long dead by this point, what he started would really linger within their culture, until being hit with waves of the remnants of Reaganism in the 1980s before their fall in 1991. And considering that even going back to Trotsky and Eisenstein in the 20s, the Russians used film as a medium to reinforce their cultural power during the formation of the Soviet Union, it would have been something that would have been very much as commonplace within all aspects of their art as military fetishism has been within American film since at least the 1970s. And here's really where it all falls into the territory of playing with the foundational structure of fairy tales and folklore logic, as he refuses to pray over the body out of a fear of what he knows, and the noble lord tells him that if he does this for him and prays for his daughter's salvation, then he will be given 1,000 gold pieces. And yet, if he refuses, then he will be punished by 1,000 lashes doled by his executioner. And so the rest of the film is the 3 different nights that he is praying over this body in this wonderfully textured set, where upon the beginning of the prayer, the body awakens and searches for him in the dark but cannot find him because of a magical protective circle that he has drawn around himself. The first night, she merely feels around. The second night, she flies through the air in her coffin to try and break down his mystical walls. And then the third night is the entire reason that the film was made, and is one of the most iconic 5 minutes in horror film history. She awakens in her coffin and immediately calls forth the help of the goblins, the ghouls, vampires, and werewolves, and all sorts of creatures of the night to find this man of God and put an end to his prayers. And just everything about this sequence is incredible. The lighting, the makeup designs, how these actors are coached to move, the hands coming out of the ground, literally the forces of evil making their way out of the woodwork of this house of the Lord to help this spirit that has possibly corrupted this body of this girl. Everything about it is just so fucking fantastic. It's just stellar. There's nothing to say about it other than it's just some of the most peak shit that was being done in this time. But then the real disappointment comes, as when these monsters are incapable of finding the priest, the girl summons forth the demon V to find him. And you're like, oh shit, these guys were super cool and they couldn't find the priest. And now we're calling in the heavy that the film itself is even named after. This is gonna be great. And then V actually walks into the room and suddenly you're like, oh right, I'm watching a Soviet movie made for no money in 1967 because everything about this costume sucks the fucking air out of the moment and renders an otherwise incredible scene as feeling a bit silly and deflated. There's a reason that the only time you see GIFs and things posted from this movie, it's always just clips from the third night, but only before V actually shows up. This goes from being high art to just being on par with 50s era sci-fi slop in like record time. And I kind of hate how much of a fumble this is. Almost everything after he enters the room is kind of bad, and this great film then fizzles out into just being kind of nothing. I get the limitations that they were under. I'm perfectly aware of that. But part of having limitations is realizing what should be attempted within the boundaries of what you have at your disposal. And they just clearly did not have the money for what they were wanting to do here, and it just shows hard. Especially when it's revealed that V has magic eyes that hide behind his long eyelids that expose the philosopher and breaks the seal of his magic circle, that allows the demons to pounce on him and consume his flesh and spirit before fleeing at the sound of the morning rooster call. And the next morning, the body of the priest is found in the church along with the body of the girl, that is once again reverted into being an old woman. And I don't even know what any of this means, but I just kind of love it, because we never actually see any of the people who live in the village again. Only the people who discover the bodies. And in your mind, there remains just this very real possibility that everything that we have seen is an illusion designed by the witch. The film never explicitly says this, but enough information is given to where it feels like a very logical conclusion that could be drawn that may be true. And I both love that and find it to be a really scary idea. But that's not the end of the film, as we then just cut to this bizarre comedy scene of these two priests drinking together while talking about how wild this whole thing was while doing chores back at the college. And then it ends. And you're left with this really weird feeling that most of the movie really works, but it just totally falls apart right after showing you one of the coolest things that's ever been put to screen. And I honestly even kind of wonder if this last scene was implemented in a kind of Invasion of the Body Snatchers way, where they weren't allowed to have the downer ending that they wanted to and were instead forced to include this goofy sequence at the end with these priests, to show that life will go on, and that things aren't actually all that bad and will be okay again. I don't know. I've tried to reckon with this final scene, and the only way that it makes sense to me is if it was tacked on by force. Because there's no logical artistic reason as to why you would follow up what is clearly intended to be the final shot of the film with this silly moment with characters that we don't really know, that actually serves no purpose other than to undercut the severity of what an intense moment the ending otherwise could be. But this also sort of adds to what a strange experience V is. Nothing about it is traditional in any sense of the word, and it really just lives in my mind despite its flaws as this sort of idealization of what horror can be on a just total weirdo level. A true testament to the fact that to be iconic, all you've got to have is a bunch of gross little guys and a dream. I mean, what more could you want?